In my conversations this month with chief strategy officers, I'm hearing a recurring theme being mentioned that the traditional annual strategic planning cycle is increasingly out of sync with today's rapidly evolving business environment. Since the beginning of capitalism, corporations have adhered to this yearly planning rhythm. But the current landscape is different. Opportunities and challenges arise and dissipate faster than an annual strategic planning cycle can deal with. The idea that we need more agile strategic approaches, that we need to turn strategic planning into an ongoing habit rather than an annual ritual is not new. Strategists have been talking about this for years. We use scenario planning, we use agile teams, continuous feedback loops, etc. But I believe we are approaching a breaking point. Rita McGrath, one of our favorite strategic thought leaders, in her book, Seeing Around Corners, she emphasizes this idea of inflection points, these critical moments when significant change occurs. And those inflection points don't care about your annual schedule until such inflection points we could anticipate. They kind of came out many years from now. We didn't know exactly when they would hit, but we could conduct a scenario analysis and come up with a plan and be ready monitoring to adjust when it did occur. But now the gap from when we think of an inflection point and it actually happens is starting to get so short that it fits within a year. And that creates a fundamental problem. Look, we've been doing corporate strategic planning, you could argue, for 422 years, since the first corporation in the world was created. And we've always done it in an annual rhythm. So I got curious, where does this annual rhythm come from? Why do we follow it still? And how can we change it? And what I found is that the annual planning cycle is really ancient. And although it is becoming obsolete, we won't be able to change it. So instead of looking at speeding up the cycle, we should look at introducing a polyrhythmic planning model. Let me explain. First, the annual cycle is ancient. It comes from nature. In ancient times, societies structured their activities around the agricultural calendar. Whether you were a hunter-gatherer or a farmer, the rhythms of when you worked and when you planned were driven by the fact that it takes 365 days for the earth to rotate around the sun. So what did farmers do? In the spring, they plant peas and spinach. Later in spring, they plant pumpkins, squash, and root vegetables. In the summer, they harvest their peas and spinach. And they plant corn, tomatoes, and beans. In the fall, they harvest their pumpkins, squash, and root vegetables. In the winter, they do their planning and maintenance tasks. Is it any wonder that in the winter, as our fields lie fallow, at least in the northern hemisphere, that we turn to planning and maintenance? No, it was necessary. But my second point is that it's going to take too long to try to change that cycle, because the manors and the counties and the kingdoms and empires that tax those farmers scheduled their annual tax assessments after the harvest season when farmers had liquid assets available. So naturally, even as businesses evolved away from farming towards manufacturing and services which don't depend on the cycles of the planets, their practices continue to mirror these taxation cycles. If governments demand annual financial reporting to align with their taxation cycle, so businesses might as well align their financial reporting rhythm. And what a more ideal time to create a forecast and a plan, which makes it an ideal time for performance reviews, to decide on promotions and set salaries. And while you're at it, well, you might as well set your goals and KPIs and operating plans. And your employees' entire lives become pegged to this annual cycle. They want to know at the beginning of the year what their salary is going to be so that they can make long-term decisions like, should I buy this house or should I rent this house? You see, the entire system is deeply intertwined. Untangling the annual calendar of 365 days will take decades. It has been attempted before, however. Henry Ford, for example, proposed a 9-day week so businesses could create shifts of 6 days on and 3 days off. It went nowhere. Yet the pace at which the challenges in our environment occur rarely correlate with Earth's location to the sun. They happen faster. In January 2024, you could not have predicted that Middle East conflicts or trade conflicts between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Mexico would have disrupted global supply chains. You probably wouldn't have predicted that 2024 hurricane season would be the most active in record, causing droughts and fires and flooding and significant impact on supply chains. And we haven't even mentioned the skyrocketing acceleration of technology adoption with generative AI. So we are approaching this critical moment The planning cycle our environments are demanding of us is moving from 5 years to 3 years to less than a year. Yet your planning cycle is locked into a year. It's like a band with a guitarist, a bass player, and a singer, and they're all operating in sync, but the drummer starts accelerating. When the drummer's pace exceeds the training of the other players to keep up, it creates a mismatch in tempo that will lead to a cacophony. So, how does a company avoid a destructive cacophony? You're not going to be able to slow down the pace of change. You're not going to be able to get everyone to abandon the annual planning cycle. Can a sub-annual planning cycle exist at the same time as an annual one? Actually, it's not unheard of. In jazz music, one sees what's known as a polyrhythm. You might have one layer of 4 beats per measure and one layer of 3 beats per measure, and they come together periodically, in that case, every 12 measures. So we could create a new rhythm inside our planning cycle without having to wait for the pace of the external environment to change. And I'm seeing some interesting experiments going on inside companies that are attempting to create the flexibility to do this. And there are several, but here are 4. One of the members of Outthinker Network are changing how they do resource allocation. They require each business unit to give up a percentage of their annual budget. For illustrative purposes, let's call it 20%. That business must now operate with 80% of the budget that they need. The 20% that they give up, they contribute to a company-wide fund that will be allotted across business units as opportunities and threats emerge throughout the year. This allows them to shift funding between business units more fluidly. The Chinese company Hire has a model, which you've heard me talk about before, where each employee's salary is pegged to performance. So instead of earning 100, you might earn instead 75. That 25 that you give up could become 50 if we perform well, could become less than 25 if you don't. This creates variability in the budget, which allows them to move on opportunities more fluidly. The strategic approach that John Hagel calls zoom out, zoom in is also popular among strategy officers. The idea is that you zoom out far ahead, years ahead, get clear on what your goals are, then zoom in to a very short term, 6 months or 3 months, and set a strategy that gets you to where you will need to be to achieve your long term. This way you can be pivoting throughout the year. At a speech I gave last week, one of the speakers used a great quote by Jeff Bezos that speaks to this. He said, "We are stubborn on vision, but flexible on details." And Rita McGrath offers another interesting solution. When you have multiple projects that have short planning cycles, it's hard to predict what the results will be. So you take several of those projects and you wrap them up into one overarching theme. You basically diversify away the risk and make it predictable. If one project is moving too slowly, another one's probably moving faster, and vice versa. This allows you to produce a predictable rhythm, even if your internal rhythm is not predictable. There are other approaches that we can experiment with, but these 4 should get us pretty far along. 1, keep 20% of your budget set aside for unexpected opportunities and threats. 2, convince your employees to take more of their compensation tied to performance. 3, have a 5-year plan and then a 3-month plan. Zoom out and zoom in. Number 4, plan not on one project, but on a portfolio of projects. These approaches can help us create polyrhythm. We can beat internally at the right pace to stay ahead of the pace of change in the marketplace, and yet each winter we synchronize with our investors and our tax collectors and employees.